Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Amal Ketata. I'm the founder of Nui, a blue finance startup. And as a member of NTC, I'm coordinating a series of webinars and workshops focused on ocean tech. It's a very dynamic space to be in, and I hope these events will serve as a knowledge sharing platform for the ocean tech community to find inspiration and support. Orion, our speaker today, will present himself later, is part of the NTC community, and we're very grateful for his time and effort and sharing his perspective about photogrammetry. We recently attended together largest conference about coral restoration, and photogrammetry was one of the hottest topics. It has evolved quite significantly in the past couple of years and holds great potential in supporting monitoring activities for practitioners in marine conservation more broadly. So we'll learn about the challenges of implementing it and how to overcome them. And before giving the floor to Orion, I just wanted to mention two important things. First, the presentation will last about 35 to 40 minutes, and we'll open the floor for questions afterwards. So feel free to put your questions as they come in the chat, and we will address them first come, first serve when we open the Q&A session. And the second point is that this will be recorded. So you'll follow us on all the platforms, and you'll hopefully have the link. Orion, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amal. Yeah, and thank you all for having me here today. My name is Orion McCarthy, and I am going to be talking about recent and emerging applications of photogrammetry for coral reef science and restoration. And I also want to talk a little bit about the results of a recent study that I led that looked at how accessible photogrammetry is for conservation and ways that we can make this and other conservation technologies more accessible. So first, just a little bit about me. I'm a recent PhD graduate from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in California. And while I was in graduate school, I worked closely with doctors Jennifer Smith and Stuart Sandin, who both use photogrammetry to study primarily coral reef change over time, but also some other local ecosystems in Southern California as well. And all three of us are ecologists by training, and our focus is really on applied conservation research that leverages long-term monitoring to have these longer-term insights into how ecosystems are changing. And through that work with them at Scripps, I became really excited about the potential for harnessing nature tech to improve conservation outcomes. And that brought me to Seatrees, where I currently work. And Seatrees is a California-based nonprofit that supports marine restoration efforts led by coastal communities around the world. And this includes, in addition to coral reefs, we also work in mangrove forests, kelp forests, seagrass meadows, oyster reefs, and coastal watersheds. And I am there in my capacity as their lead scientist, where I help these community-led projects design monitoring programs to gauge the impact of restoration on marine biodiversity. And since joining, I also helped to launch our new biodiversity blocks portfolio, which is a collection of marine biodiversity credit projects that are really aiming to increase the long-term monitoring duration of restoration and also the transparency around data. And there's a big need for conservation tech to support these projects and a desire for that tech to be usable by the local communities that are implementing restoration. So that's going to be a big theme throughout the talk today. So I'm not going to go into more detail about the biodiversity blocks project right now, but I'm happy to answer questions at the end or over email. But today, what I do want to talk about is how photogrammetry is used to study coral reefs. And before I get there, it's important to consider why. Why use photogrammetry? What value does it provide? What added value? And I think generally these 3D models of marine ecosystems really help to democratize nature. They effectively allow us to peel back the ocean and reveal and archive the underwater world for everyone to be able to see. And this allows us as researchers, as practitioners, to be able to tell stories about change over time in a specific place, and also to help us develop these site-specific solutions. And this is important because, especially for coral reefs, because every coral reef is different and because coral reefs are changing very rapidly, but this change is not always easy to pick up with the naked eye or even with even through graphs and data. So one of my primary takeaways from years of coral reef fieldwork is that coral reefs show an incredible amount of variation, both around the world, but even along a coastline within the same island. And each of these reefs experiences a unique set of environmental conditions and different disturbances over time. And that helps to shape the habitat structure of the reef, but also its species composition. So you can think of a coral reef almost like a town or a community, and its character and inhabitants are really shaped by its location and its unique history. So that context is really important because conservation strategies that work well in one location might not work everywhere. And so for conservation to be effective, we must understand that local context and we must be able to tell each reef's individual story. So we've traditionally told these stories with graphs and data collected in the field using low-tech methods like transects and photoquadrats. But photogrammetry allows us to tell a much more compelling and informative story for these reefs. And we can overlap imagery of the same coral reefs from different years and literally watch corals grow or die. And this helps us develop a better understanding of the factors driving reef resilience or decline. And that can help us develop better conservation solutions and improve the success of restoration programs. And for the general public and policymakers, a 3D visual record of ecosystem recovery or decline is really valuable for driving home conservation messaging and helping people form a connection with an ecosystem they might not get to experience in person. So that's really what motivates us at Scripps to go out and document these patterns of coral reef change over time from around the world. And so I want to take a moment to provide some perspectives from the field about how Scripps collects and uses photogrammetry data to answer some of these questions. So when we go out into the field, we swim with divers and cameras above the reef, sort of following a long mower pattern to swim in a grid and take pictures every second. And here you can see a diver swimming back and forth, taking thousands of pictures of an area of reef. Usually we're surveying an area about 100 meters squared and aiming to get comprehensive coverage via photos of the reef. And here you can see that illustrated. And this red circle is showing the position of the same point, but you can see it's from a different angle in each of these different pictures. And that ability to photograph fixed objects from different angles is what allows us to create a 3D point cloud reconstruction of the environment. And that's done using structure from motion algorithms. Most people in the field use the software Agisoft Metashape, but there's a number of other platforms as well. From this 3D point cloud, we can create a number of other data products, such as a 3D digital elevation model, which we can use to measure habitat structural complexity, or a large area 2D image that's top down, which we call an orthoprojection. Some people also call it a photomosaic, and we can use that to track individual colonies or create a habitat map. And collectively, this whole consortium of 3D and 2D products is called large area imagery. So I'm going to use that term going forward because it is a little bit more comprehensive, but if you're used to hearing the term photogrammetry, that's essentially what I mean. And while at Scripps we use divers, the large area imagery doesn't always involve diver collected imagery. It can use drones or AUVs, and it can be done above or below water. And really it works for ecosystems or environments where there are stable features. So when we're in a coral reef, we're not reconstructing the fish because the fish are moving around and we can't get that multiple view of the same fixed point from different directions. Similarly, in kelp forests or seagrass beds, it can be hard because the seaweed or algae is moving back and forth. So it's really well suited for coral reefs in particular because the substrate is static. But again, there's lots of other ecosystems where this can be used as well. And one example, the really one non-coral reef example that I'll share today is from the intertidal zone, also near Scripps, and in collaboration with Scripps and some tribes along the west coast of the United States that are using large area imagery to study the tide pools and specifically look at how storms and sea level rise are impacting the distribution of species in the tide pools and how they change with the different zones of the intertidal. So why use large area imagery for coral reef science, conservation, and restoration? I've already spoken a little bit about the benefits, especially around tracking and visualizing change over time, but this technology also has multiple benefits from a research perspective. It creates this really powerful data set of virtual ecosystems that can be reused over and over in a variety of different research contexts, which creates this economy of scale that can minimize the cost associated with fieldwork, especially if that fieldwork is somewhere remote. And as the name implies, this technology can also be used to survey very large areas at high resolution. And so currently, the widespread practice is to do this over hundreds of meters squared, but we're even seeing this technology applied to cover hectares of coral reefs underwater. So basically entire reefs, which is a really exciting advance. So as an example of these benefits, here you can see an annotated 3D reef model from Palmyra Atoll, where researchers from Scripps basically annotated hundreds of individual coral colonies so that they can be tracked over time. And tracking coral colonies is one of the primary use cases of large area imagery in the coral reef research context, because that allows us to measure coral growth and death and understand if coral populations are stable or declining. And for this reef on Palmyra, I'll note that Palmyra is incredibly remote and expensive to get to, so it really wouldn't be feasible to track hundreds of coral colonies in the field while on scuba. But this imagery allows us to unlimited access to do this sort of study back in the lab, making it possible for the first time to answer questions like this. Not to mention the possibility we can use this exact same 3D model to answer a bunch of different research questions and for different researchers. Another common use case of large area imaging in marine ecology is to measure the percent cover of different species of corals and algae on the sea floor. And historically, this was done using small discontinuous quadrats that were separated across the reef and maybe analyzing based on photos. But now we can do that over a large continuous area from the 3D model. And this often involves identifying species from the actual raw imagery that was used to create the 3D model, as you can see here. And unlike those older methods, with large area imagery, we have access to multiple different views of the same point, which can really help us if there's blurry pictures or if the thing we're interested in is occluded by a fish or some other object. And so it's really helpful for creating more accurate data. Still, this whole process can be time consuming to do manually, which when I was doing my PhD, I actually was clicking through these pictures and identifying things manually. And for each site, it was like 2,500 points. So it would take 6 to 8 hours per site to go through that. So you can imagine how time consuming that process is. Fortunately, there's multiple different research groups, including some collaborators of mine at Scripps and at NOAA, who are working on integrating AI and machine learning to automate this process somewhat. And a major hurdle that is still being encountered is that is reaching this really high level of accuracy that we need for coral reef research, where often these AI approaches will max out at around 85 to 90% accuracy, which sounds really good, but when researchers are interested in detecting a change of 1% cover of a particular species, we need this really high precision and accuracy for our AI tools. So this is still an area of active research and development. But thankfully, there's no shortage of training data, especially even just in the Scripps context. We, through this initiative called the 100 Island Challenge, have been going out and doing an enormous amount of field work to document coral reef condition. And the 100 Island Challenge is, as the name implies, going to 100 different islands around the world, imaging about 100 square meter sites at each island, and then going back to each of those sites at least once so that we can have this global view of how coral reefs are changing. And the experimental design is set up so it's across a gradient of both high and low islands. So like big volcanic islands like Hawaii all the way to atolls. Also a gradient of human population and a gradient of high to low productivity in the ocean. So it'll allow us to look across these different gradients and be able to say how coral reefs are changing in that context to understand which factors are important on high islands with people, which factors are important on low uninhabited islands, and so on. And so this is a huge data set. We're currently working through analyzing it. A lot of my PhD work was focused on just one small element of it, our long-term monitoring in the Maui Nui region of Hawaii using our time series of 3D models. And these maps are showing some of that data. On the left, you can see coral cover when we first started monitoring at our sites in this part of Hawaii. And then on the right, you can see change in coral cover over the next 6 years. And I'll point out, just to reiterate the point I made in the earlier slides about coral reefs being very, very different and variable. You can see how some sites right next to each other started with similar coral cover, but the actual trajectory they showed over the next 6 years was very different. Just highlighting that there can be we need to think on a very fine scale about conservation and restoration of these systems because there can be a lot of variability. And large area imaging is a great way to do that. And actually, some of the results from this work are going to be published very soon in Global Change Biology. So if you're interested in learning more about this specific use case, feel free to check that out. But zooming in from that map to a single point, we can use the large area imagery to look at how individual reefs are changing. And here, this is a reef from Maui that was damaged by a historic wave event in 2022. And in the middle, you can see red and blue color coding. The red indicates parts of the reef that were lost in that time period, and blue is new structure that was gained. And just as an example here, you can see how this large coral colony, which is about 0.5 meter to 1 meter across, was completely removed and tossed off the reef, leaving just a crater behind. And that's not terribly surprising knowing the magnitude of this wave event. The waves were about 2 to 3 meters tall, and that's about how deep this site is. You can imagine those waves just crashing and pounding the reef. It doesn't take an expert to realize that would cause damage, but what this sort of visual is interesting and allows us to learn something new is that we can see very clearly when these models are layered on top of each other that the damage was not distributed across the reef equally. Here we can see in these little channels, these spur and groove formations, there was a lot of loss of structure, particularly concentrated in those areas. And so just an example of how this imagery and this data can help us to learn something about how a disturbance event actually impacts the reef mechanistically to see where that damage is concentrated. But it's not all about coral reef decline. Large area imagery also allows us to document reef recovery and coral growth, particularly from restoration projects. And so I just want to share a few visuals from this restoration project from Palmyra Atoll, which I mentioned before. Here you can see now a map of how Palmyra is really just smack in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's an uninhabited island except for a research station. And so it's this really interesting natural laboratory where we can see what climate impacts are for coral reefs in the absence of all those other local human impacts. And so there was a ship grounding here in the 90s that the ship got removed and then led to an outbreak of this invasive soft coral that also had to be removed. And through all that impact, researchers outplanted some corals. And you can see over here this ortho projection of that the plot is 3 by 3 meters. And over the course of just a few years, we can watch how those corals grow pretty rapidly to cover a large area of that restoration plot. And that growth continued up until last year when there was a bleaching event that knocked some of it back. But it really highlights how if you take away those local human impacts, how restoration can lead to these really rapid gains in terms of coral cover and coral growth. Of course, in much of the world, there's a lot of human impacts. So we're not just going to pursue coral restoration in isolated places like Palmyra. So I want to share this example from Seatrees, where I currently work, which is working with Scripps and a local partner called Ocean Gardener in Bali to use low-cost methods to do restoration and also to conduct monitoring with large area imagery. So the project is focused on using low-cost biodegradable materials such as wood and ropes to use for their coral nurseries and also for outplanting, attaching those fragments to those ropes. So you can see sort of the linear formation in this 3D model is because of that. And then also you can notice the quality of this model is a little bit different, a little lower, and that's partly because they were using these more accessible low-cost GoPro cameras. And so, of course, the quality of your camera is going to impact the quality of the 3D model, and to some extent, the types of data that you can pull out of it. But that is, of course, it depends on what you're trying to get out of the project and what the ultimate goal of the photogrammetry effort is. And if you want to learn more about this project, check out that QR code. Now, I want to highlight how important it is to track the fate of restoration projects, particularly in the coral space, where corals are facing increased threats from local human impacts, but also from climate change. And you have things like bleaching events, where these marine heat waves come in and can cause widespread bleaching and mortality of corals. And so we need to be following our restoration projects over time to see if all of that effort that we put in, what is the ultimate outcome of that through these disturbance events. But it's also worth bringing up that it's another use case for studying the impact of these bleaching events with photogrammetry, because different corals have different bleaching susceptibility and different amounts of thermal tolerance. And so I'll illustrate that here with an example from my own research in Maui, where you can see 5 different surveys from the same reef conducted over the course of 7 years. And here you can see the impact of multiple bleaching events, one in 2015 and one in 2019, where corals bleach white during these spikes in ocean temperature. But some corals die, some corals recover, and others don't bleach at all, even though they're all experiencing pretty much the same environmental conditions. So there's a lot of interest in the research community in digging into this from a restoration perspective to understand which corals are thermally tolerant. And as I mentioned, one of the use cases of large area imagery is tracking these corals over time. Here you can see an example of that using this software called TagLab, which allows users to trace the boundaries of corals on that 2D ortho projection. And there's some AI machine learning assisted segmentation or tracing, as you can see there. With just a few clicks, it can snap to the boundary of the coral. But it is very complicated for corals, because you have the ability for a coral to partially die, where some of the coral tissue dies and the colony can split into 2 different colonies, and then those later can grow back into a single colony. And there's lots of different pathways for coral growth and death. And so it's important to have this ability through TagLab to match these corals in these 2 different panels together and to create this linkage of an individual colony. And this is a huge improvement over older workflows that when I first started my PhD, we were still doing this in Photoshop and manually tracing and then converting those pixels into an area and manually matching things. So this is just a huge advancement that I think will continue to get more efficient. So just an example of some of the data that can come out of these tracing processes. Here's a population level look at how corals fared through those 2 bleaching events that I showed in Maui in that video. And this data here is visualized across 6 sites for 4 different species of corals. And the different colored bars here show how the proportion of corals with similar bleaching responses over time differed across those sites and species. So I won't go into details of the study and the results here. If you want that, you can check that out, the QR code. The main point I want you to take away is that we can use data like these to understand the spatial and taxonomic variability in bleaching impacts. And that can help us identify locations that need help and also allow us to pick hardier species or even hardier individual corals for these restoration programs. And this can become even more powerful when we layer in genetic data. And so some of my collaborators at Scripps are working on this as part of the Builders Initiative to collect tissue samples from individual coral colonies for 15 different species in 3 different geographies and species that are individual corals that are within our large area imaging plots. And the goal is to identify the natural adaptive solutions that can be applied in the context of conservation and restoration efforts, and to identify the most resilient phenotypes and genotypes of corals. And that can really help us as researchers to unpack the biological mechanisms that corals use to adapt to these changing environmental conditions, but it can also help us uncover the most beneficial environmental contexts for growth and survival, which can help us inform conservation. So just another example of combining large area imagery with other data sources. This is a digital twin effort called Digital Reefs that's led by Woods Hole, but also in collaboration with Scripps, the Nature Conservancy, and Stanford. And it's back to Palmyra, an effort to build a comprehensive digital twin of that coral reef. And this effort is envisioned broadly to assist with decision-making by using this extremely comprehensive hydrodynamic and temperature modeling that can be combined with the fine scale imagery data to really serve as a platform for stakeholders to be able to visualize and game out these what if scenarios that can inform restoration and management. And just as an example, on Palmyra, there is this big causeway that was built during World War II that sort of divides the lagoon in half. You can sort of see it here on the right side of the image. And so simulations like this can allow us to test, well, what if we were to create a break in that causeway? How would that impact the flow? How would that impact coral, the larval flow of the coral gametes and stuff like that? It would be a very expensive project to do. And so it's important to be able to simulate these what if scenarios before embarking on that. And just one final application of large area imagery that I want to touch on is for disaster response and litigation. I mentioned work in Maui that I've done with the lab. We had a lot of partners that were heavily impacted by those wildfires that destroyed Lahaina in 2023. And we had some coral reef sites that were pretty close by that have now before imagery from before the fire. And in 2024, we worked with Pacific Whale Foundation and Maui Pacific Divers to add additional sites very close to the burn scars to better understand how this reef has been impacted and changing over time. And we're planning on continuing to monitor to see how the rebuilding of Lahaina impacts the health of those reefs. And so just as an example of how this imagery is not just for future looking restoration and how are these projects going to change over time, but it can also be a retroactive perspective that can be helpful in other contexts outside of research, such as in litigation. So I've given a lot of examples of how projects that I'm involved in or tangentially involved in have used large area imagery, but I want to zoom out for a more standardized look at how this technology has been applied to date by the coral reef science community. So as part of my PhD, I led a study in collaboration with the large area imaging experts shown here to better understand how this technology has been applied. And we did that by conducting a literature review of coral reef studies that used large area imagery between 2010 and 2021. And one of our major goals was to identify gaps in the literature where additional use of this technology could have a greater impact. And in addition, we were interested in comparing the uptake of large area imaging between several groups, including between the academic and conservation research communities and between researchers in the global north and the global south. And so just for a little plug, and I do think this would be useful for a lot of folks, the database of studies that we compiled for this can be found at the QR code along with the full study. And I've found it helpful to go back and look at that database, just querying which studies study demography over this time period in this location. It's a really easy way to get a sense of how what this literature is about and how this technology has been applied to date for coral reefs. In addition to that literature review, we also, as part of this effort, surveyed 135 coral reef scientists and conservation practitioners to gauge their familiarity with large area imaging and to get a sense of what barriers they face to using it. We also conducted follow-up interviews with 45 of those respondents to further probe their answers, particularly to understand how they would like to use large area imaging if all of those barriers to adoption were suddenly lifted. So focusing on the literature review first, how has large area imaging been used to date? In the center here, you can see some of the topic areas that we use to categorize studies, and the bars to the left represent the proportion of all studies in our review that fit within each topic area. So you can see the most common applications so far include validating the precision and accuracy of large area imaging, measuring 3D habitat structure, documenting change over time, and quantifying benthic community composition. And this isn't particularly surprising. These are all applications that speak to the strengths of this technology and fit well within sort of the traditional focuses of coral reef ecology so far. Additional applications that were somewhat common include tracking restoration, measuring coral growth and population demographics, spatial dynamics of benthic organisms, and looking at bleaching and disease. And here you can see just some examples from a few studies that both focus at that colony scale, but also at the broader reef scale. And beyond that, we can see there's a bunch of exciting emerging applications where large area imagery has the potential to be applied, but hasn't been done so very frequently, at least not as of 2021. And this includes cutting edge research that combines large area imagery with other forms of data, such as genetic data, bioacoustics, or other environmental data to create these really comprehensive digital twins of coral reefs. So I want to layer on some of our survey responses here. When we asked our survey respondents how they would like to use large area imaging, we noticed some areas of overlap with the existing literature shown here in green, but we also noticed some gaps, which are shown in yellow. So there's really an opportunity to use large area imagery to conduct more applied conservation research that can help to address some of these gaps and better serve the needs of conservation practitioners. And this gap may be partially explained by who has been publishing studies to date. Here you can see a map of where large area imaging has been applied with point size corresponding to the number of studies conducted in each location and point color indicating the global affiliation of study authors. And these colors are mirrored in the bar plot on the left, which shows the recent uptick in large area imaging publications over time. As Amal mentioned, it's the new hot thing in coral reef science. So you'll notice a pretty stark trend. There's a lot of orange and not much purple on this map, a trend that continues through time, even as large area imaging has gained popularity. And this suggests that large area imaging currently remains out of reach to many organizations in the global south. And part of the reason here is that there's many barriers that can prevent organizations from using large area imagery, and it won't come as a surprise to many of you, and these barriers are broader than just for large area imaging. They face a lot of nature tech. And money is, of course, the biggest barrier to adoption, but it also equipment and that training and technical capacity and staff capacity are also major barriers. But encouragingly, that sort of lack of interest and perception of few applications are smaller, not really perceived largely as barriers across the entire community. Of course, when we focus on conservation practitioners in particular, we can see that barriers are magnified, which is not a surprise given that funding is a bigger barrier in the sort of practitioner NGO space in general. And here we can see that equipment and money are perceived to be bigger barriers for conservation practitioners than academic researchers, and that while both groups considered few applications of imaging to be a minor barrier, conservation practitioners were more likely to say there were few to no applications, which could be in part because the literature has been sort of churning out these studies and applications that are less in line with their interests. And then conservation practitioners were also still more likely to view opposition from funders or communities to be a bigger barrier than scientists did. And even though that number isn't large, it is there. And I'll talk about that in a little bit of some of the reasons why that might be. Interestingly, however, a majority of our respondents in the conservation field, nonprofit sector, and the Global South said they do expect to use large area imaging in the future. And so these results suggest that this technology is widely viewed as the future of coral reef science. But as we've shown to date, the uptake of it has been uneven. So to complement these Likert plots, I also want to share some insights from our follow-up interviews that relate to these questions of sort of equity and community engagement. Quite a few of our interviewees expressed skepticism that local communities could be effectively integrated into large area imaging workflows due to that training component required. But others noted that training local divers to take pictures following these protocols could be easier than training divers in coral ID or to conduct fish counts, for example. So a bit of a mixed perspectives there. In addition, interviewees expressed concerns about outsourcing in-water data collection to analysts working behind a computer. And these arose from both an ecological and an equity and conservation efficacy standpoint. For one example we heard was from a group that works in the Philippines with these local fishermen who are on the side. They're also going out and monitoring the reef as divers. And they go back to their community and they spread that sort of conservation ethos and stewardship messaging with their fellow community members. And we were talking about if you were to implement imaging that took those divers out of the equation and the analysis was done behind a computer, you would lose that connection to the local community that is the actual mechanism by which conservation is being effective, that sort of community engagement piece. And so it's important to not lose sight of that when we're thinking about how can we scale up data quality and just scaling the monitoring in general. We want to make sure that's not coming at the expense of the ultimate conservation goal. And then also just from an ecological standpoint, having divers in the water is what leads to a lot of sort of off-the-cuff observations that are not directly related to the research question you're studying, but can really help to provide that context to piece together this question of what is driving change. And so taking divers out of the water and completely replacing having drones and AUVs fully collecting data can be a bit of a double-edged sword. Again, you can cover larger areas, but if you're losing that perspective and treating these 3D models as true reconstructions of the reef, it could lead to some gaps in how we're ecologically interpreting what we're seeing. So some notes on the equity piece. The barriers associated with large area imaging, particularly the barriers related to cost, equipment, staffing, and training, make it a difficult technology for under-resourced organizations to use. And some organizations will never be able to bear the costs of adopting this technology, and others will only be able to use pared down camera types or freeware that may be below the broader data standards of the coral reef science industry. And so we need to recognize how that imbalance brings up questions of equity and social justice, and that it really isn't acceptable for this to be the standard going forward, and that it can be only used by tech savvy or academic users. Because unless we take these concerted efforts to make large area imaging more accessible, we face this prospect of excluding researchers from the global south, perpetuating parachute science, and conducting this research that's out of step with the needs of conservation practitioners. So it's really important that we ask ourselves, how can we make large area imaging a more accessible tool for conservation? And so to answer this question, it helps to understand how users experience these barriers over the lifespan of a large area imaging project. Early on, it's really this lack of knowledge and fundraising that our interviewees perceived as primary challenges. Especially sort of understanding what it takes to stand up a monitoring program, what sort of equipment to buy. And then as you move on to actually implementing, other barriers start to become more apparent, such as having the staff capacity and time to actually do the work and buy those software licenses, build the 3D models, and extract data. And then once respondents had successfully started using large area imaging, they faced an entirely different set of challenges with scaling up their work, especially data storage is a common one that people face. So we believe that having a sense of these sequential barriers at the outset of a project would help new users navigate the process of adopting this technology and lead to more uptake. And scientists at well-resourced organizations should really think about where we can fit into this sequence to help alleviate obstacles and facilitate others as they onboard technology that we may already be using. So with that, I want to close with a set of recommendations for making large area imaging more accessible. And these recommendations were developed based on that feedback from our survey and those follow-up interviews. And I'm happy to share that we've made some forward progress on many of them since we published this study in 2023. So on the research and development side, we need a common and accessible set of imaging methods and SOPs that folks can use when getting started. I encourage people to check out, using the QR code on the left, this guide developed by a colleague of mine, Clint Edwards, that clearly describes the foundational principles and best practices for large area imaging surveys, and especially for help with program management and monitoring design. And it also contains examples of multiple published SOPs, which is helpful. Then there's the advent of user-friendly free software like TagLab, which leverages machine learning to expedite that ecological data processing. And that's been a huge step towards broader accessibility. And there's also efforts like SetTide by Spencer Miller and Reef Shape by Will Green that are really focused on helping groups getting started answer questions about cost and having access to equipment that's very easy to use and relatively affordable. And as I showed earlier, we should really strive to conduct applied conservation research that uses this technology that meets the needs of conservation practitioners. In addition to research and development, there's a big need for training programs, workshops, and other capacity building activities. And this video is from one such workshop that I was part of in the US Virgin Islands, where restoration groups and environmental educators are working together to build this community of practice around large area imagery. And partnerships like these, which focus on sharing resources, equipment, imaging processing power, and expertise, can really help groups collaboratively level up their abilities so that they don't each have to stand up all of these components on their own. And then in addition, given the many applications of large area imagery, it's important to recognize that not all of us will use this imagery for research. Coral reef 3D models can be used for education, litigation, artwork and advocacy, and we should work with these end users to help them access the amazing potential of large area imagery in ways that make sense for them. So encouragingly, we are making a lot of progress. As Amal mentioned, that recent reef restoration conference, Reef Futures, which we both attended in December of last year, there was a lot of focus on photogrammetry and large area imagery at that conference, including a 2-day workshop that was focused on sort of the newest and cutting edge advances in large area imaging, both from a workflow perspective of having these AI assisted tools, but also from the sheer scale of imaging, some talking about how to image very large areas, because once you transition from hundreds of square meters to hectares, you start using like a whole different approach, different camera systems, and all of that. I'll also note that even the poster session, where there was a lot of research by early career professionals, these master's students, and even some undergrads, there is widespread use of photogrammetry and large area imaging in their methods. And so I think it's a sign that in the broader community is starting to overcome those hurdles related to accessibility. But of course, we still have ways to go to make sure it's not just the researchers at institutions that have those resources, but everyone who can get on board as this becomes an industry standard. So I want to close out by pointing out that a lot of these barriers to adoption are widespread across the nature tech space. They're not unique to photogrammetry and large area imaging. And this is not a figure from one of my papers. It's from a paper published in 2021 that looked at interest in many different types of emerging nature tech and also barriers that groups face in terms of accessing them. And this is very similar to the results of our survey. You can see that all of these technologies are viewed as a potential game changer, at the very least very helpful, but that lots of groups have moderate to major to critical constraints to using them. And so it's really not acceptable to outsource all of the data collection and analysis to groups that have the resources to be able to use this technology. We should focus on building local science capacity to be able to use nature tech, because that local science capacity is a major part of conservation and a major part of what makes conservation successful. That increases local ownership and leads to more durable outcomes. And we need this higher resolution data is not worth it if we're undermining these more critical baseline social things. Our goal should be to make large area imaging and other forms of nature tech as sort of accessible and user-friendly as GIS, which has gone through many years to decades of sort of becoming the industry standard, having lots of sort of, if you have access to a computer, there's free tools out there that you can use for mapping and for doing these really cool analyses. So yeah, I firmly believe that the training and capacity building pieces of this need to be embedded into the business plans of all nature tech organizations, because it is foundational to the mission of nature tech for conservation. And I will step down off my soapbox, and now sort of that's all I really had to share today, and I will happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Orion. I'll join a few people who commented saying the presentation is fascinating. So thank you again. I'll give the floor in a minute to Mike and Juan Camilo, who had more than one question, but I'll get a few quick ones out of the way. One question is asking about the technology used to capture the underwater imaging. Can you confirm it's Agisoft Metashape?
So yeah, so most commonly, and the one that we use at Scripps, is we collect the images and then take that sort of batch of raw imagery and use Agisoft Metashape to build the point cloud out of that. Yeah.
Okay, that's confirmed. Second question, is the presented data, which I assume is the 100 Island challenge one, will be made public?
Yeah, so the actual 3D files are pretty large in terms of being able to host those, and people have different sort of different programs have different file types. So rather than host the 3D models themselves, we are in the process of uploading all of the raw imagery to the UC's digital collections, which is part of the library system. So all of that imagery can be accessed and downloaded and cited with the DOI. And then we also have videos through the 100 Island Challenge's YouTube page that can show, if you don't want to go through and build a 3D model yourself from the raw imagery, it can show what those coral reefs look like. So it's various different points of access, all the way from like researchers that want to use this data for their own purposes to sort of stakeholders and community groups that want access to the visual, but aren't going to actually go through the technical process of working with the 3D model file.
Great. Another one is on the areas you have imaged so far, do you have any useful data about invasive species?
Great question. I think that I know for coral reefs, one of the big challenges, this isn't exactly an invasive species, but there is crown of thorns starfish is a huge challenge because they can undergo these sort of population spikes. And I actually do have a video from one of our sites in Maui that I can play while I talk about this. But these crown of thorns starfish are naturally occurring on coral reefs, and then they can undergo these population booms where there can be hundreds of them in the size of one of our 100 square meter plots. And they love to eat corals, and so they'll go through, and the white corals here you see are not actually bleached. All the tissue of the corals has been eaten by the starfish, and so you can see the following year all of that coral disappeared because it had died. But there's actually some encouraging signs from this site, at least in particular, that these starfish are both selective feeders. They prefer particular species, and they also are kind of messy eaters. So even though the reef in 2024 looks pretty barren, there are little pockets of tissue that got left behind, and these corals can sort of resheet from those remnant pieces of tissue to help the reef recover. And because the starfish, at least in this case, prefer the most dominant species of coral, it can actually help to reset the balance and promote diversity on this reef. But I know that in other locations, it has been pretty devastating, and there's been efforts to go out with sort of strike teams that remove the starfish, and so it's sort of an emerging conservation decision. In terms of other invasive species, I know that there's been some focus on invasive algae in Hawaii, and also focus on coral disease. So again, sort of departing from invasive species, but still sort of using this technology to really at the cutting edge of trying to inform those efforts to address these species level threats in coral reef ecosystems.
Great. And two questions in one. Diana is asking whether this technology could be used to monitor cold water corals, or if it has been used already. For example, the ones off the coast of Ireland or in other shallow high latitude areas across the globe. And Greg is asking whether there's any effort to use this on oil platforms or wind turbines, since those companies might want to demonstrate reef benefits.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I do know of efforts to use this for deep sea corals. There was a study, I think it was a 2021 study by an author named Price that used photogrammetry and large area imagery to create a map and then look at the spatial distribution patterns of different species of deep sea corals. And of course, the major difference between their approach and our approach is it wasn't divers with cameras. It was sort of underwater automated vehicles that were going down with cameras, and they were taking those images. But a lot of the ecology and data analysis was very similar. So it's cool from a conceptual perspective that we can do a very similar study design off of these virtual 3D models, even though the actual act of getting the data is very different. You can ask very similar questions in these types of ecosystems. So that's one example I'm aware of. I don't know of any specific examples published that are looking at sort of the underwater communities growing on oil platforms or wind turbines, but I think that is a great application of it. You certainly could do it. And I think that I wouldn't be surprised if some of those companies are already thinking about that. It just maybe, I know that the incentives for publishing are somewhat different in the sort of commercial compared to the academic space, but the technology certainly could be used for that.
Great. Another one from Chris. Has there been any research done in utilizing satellite imagery data as an alternative to underwater photos?
Yeah, so there is sort of this scale mismatch that there are multiple researchers who use remote sensing for coral reefs, and I think that one of the biggest applications of that is with habitat mapping, where you can get a sense. I know that the Allen Coral Atlas is a huge initiative that focuses on this, of creating a habitat map of, like, I think their goal is to do all coral reefs, but you can zoom in at the island scale and see where are their reefs, where is their sort of sand, rubble, seagrass, all these different coarse habitat categories. And that's really useful from a marine spatial planning perspective to say, like, we have this amount of area that is reef. If we have a target for our 30 by 30 initiative for marine conservation to target 30% of our coral reef habitat, this is how much habitat we need to protect. That's really useful. I think for some of the research questions where you're focusing on how did the species composition change, how did the habitat structure change, you do need higher resolution data than that. And there are efforts to sort of get at that with satellite data or even drone imagery as sort of the in-between step between the underwater close-up pictures. But I think in terms of some of the questions like tracking an individual coral colony through time and measuring that growth, and then or looking at even questions around coral recruitment, there's really, I think, certain things that satellites will never be able to get to in terms of that level of detail, and then certain things that a diver-based approach is really not feasible, such as measuring all the reefs over a whole island chain. So it's really picking the approaches that are make the most sense for your question, and in cases where your questions span a broad range of scales, combining different types of data to be able to answer those questions as appropriate. Just as sort of one case study of that, I think that a lot of my early PhD work looked at structural complexity and basically measuring the roughness of the reef surface and using that to quantify how much habitat there is for fish and other animals. And I know that if you're doing that at the scale of some of the 3D models I showed, those individual branching corals appear very complex because you're capturing all of that detail. But when you zoom out to a coarser scale or even look at satellite imagery, you're missing that. And instead, the complexity is from the overall shape of the reef. For example, if there's a drop-off or a ledge. And those are both different types of complexity, but they shouldn't be conflated with each other because they represent different things. And one is far more likely to disappear with climate change than the other. So we just need to make sure that when we say we're measuring something with a technology, that we're talking about the correct scale, so that we're not drawing incorrect conclusions.
Great. Next, we have some comments and questions from Mike, especially on kelp forests. And then we'll have a few questions from Juan Camilo as well. Mike, do you want to come on stage? You can unmute yourself.
Sure. I was wondering if that photogrammetry has been applied to the kelp forest in front of San Diego, in front of the San Clemente kelp forest being compared to the other islands that are more compromised. Has there ever been any underwater video documentation or comparison of the kelp that's in front of San Diego now, Scripps, to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Have they started building an archive like that yet, or is it just vacation areas? Have you guys done work on the giant kelp as far as underwater video and documenting where the kelp perimeter is at? Because it changes. It's been receding over the decades, continuously. Through yes. So you do an underwater video, and then there's a map that's showing where the video was taken, so you can understand how it's changed from 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years ago. Yeah, I know there's kelp left in front of San Diego, but it's not the same as it was even 5 years ago. Years ago.
Yeah. That's a great question. I actually, a colleague of mine in Dr. Jennifer Smith's lab is working on a variety of different kelp projects, mostly focused right in front of sort of La Jolla and San Diego, not so much on the other Channel Islands, or maybe he's expanded since I left, but it is really focused on using multiple different types of data. I know that in addition to large area imagery, I think most of his focus, at least when I was there, was focused on using I don't know, if radar or some sort of acoustics underneath a boat, and doing that with a depth sounder, I believe it was, to get the sense of the canopy and the understory of the kelp, and going in a grid with a boat to sort of using that same sort of comprehensive coverage, but using a different sort of technology to create a 3D representation of the kelp forest. And then he was exploring using photogrammetry. I think one of the major challenges with the kelp forest is you have the movement of the kelp. So the holdfast and the substrate will definitely reconstruct in a 3D model because those aren't moving. But in terms of the actual the kelp, the rest of the seaweed itself is much harder to reconstruct. So again, it depends on what the research question is. If it's purely mapping sort of the density of holdfasts or the amount of urchins or the 3D structure of the substrate, then it definitely can be used for that. If it's more for a habitat map, then getting a sense of the overall extent of the canopy, then I think the the depth sounder and the satellite-based approaches are probably going to be more the right speed.
Great. Courtney's asking, any chance you could share the researcher name who was exploring using photogrammetry to study the kelp forest?
Yes, yeah. His name is Mohammed Sederat. He goes by Mo, and he's in Dr. Jennifer Smith's lab. So if you Google, if you look up her lab, which I can share this information with them all, she has all of her different students are there, and also it'll talk about the different research projects.
Perfect. And then we'll give the floor to Juan Camilo, who has many questions, maybe group them about, data collection, application, et cetera, et cetera. And with that, we'll close the Q&A session. The floor is yours, Juan Camilo.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I couldn't unmute myself. Orion, hi, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I just have, many questions, but the overall question for all the questions that I have is there any gap in data collection, like ground truth data collection for the models that you're working on? And if there is, what's the gap? You mentioned that there's a lot of training data around all of the different islands that you're working with the 100 Island Project. Is there any gap that could be filled? Where's the gap? How could it be filled, and how could the accuracy be increased?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think from there certainly isn't a lack of imaging data between sort of the efforts that Scripps is undertaking. I know that NOAA has their National Coral Reef Monitoring Program is transitioning over to large area imaging, so now they have a wealth of data. There's tons of research in Australia, all the institutions down there that are using this. So certainly an abundance of data. I think maybe for certain research questions, like if you're interested in the nooks and crannies inside of a reef, there's certainly, because we're generally swimming over top of the reef, like that interstitial space can be understudied. But generally, I think there's a lot of data. It's just more understanding how to improve the tools for analyzing and storing and sharing that data. I think one of the huge barriers is around data storage and being able to share, like even the first question, I felt like my response of like all the raw imagery is there, you can go build your own 3D model, is a fairly unsatisfying answer, but there are a lot of just technical limitations around doing that. So I think if there is some broader effort around having this platform where users can easily view and interact with each other's data, would be probably one of the biggest hurdles facing this space. And then also increasing the accuracy of those AI, the species identification tools, and just, I know that we've made great strides on that, but I think it's still a work in progress. So those are probably some of the biggest technical barriers, more so than I think a lack of data.
And can I ask a quick follow-on?
Sure.
Would bioacoustics be useful to complement photogrammetry in a way, like the different analyses that you've been doing?
I think for sure, especially depending on the research question. I know that there's been increased interest in a restoration context. If playing certain sounds can attract coral recruits and increase the success of restoration, if it can attract fish, and also just using bioacoustics as a better way to measure fish, because fish were pretty absent from this talk. And I think if we have the substrate and the benthos pretty well covered with photogrammetry. If there's a way to fish is pretty far behind in terms of automating that process. So to the degree that bioacoustics can be leveraged to help with that, then that'll really help with getting towards these more comprehensive digital twins.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Orion. Thank you, everyone, for being here, for the interesting questions you've asked. You have Orion's contact if you have any follow-up. And as Shay said, this is a wonderful webinar. There are plenty of resources to look into now. So thanks, Orion, again for your time, for your effort, and have a great rest of your day or evening, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate the chance to talk about this.